Many people today have never heard of Hetty Green, yet during her lifetime she was so famous, or infamous depending on who you asked, that newspapers gave her a dramatic nickname, the Witch of Wall Street. One of the wealthiest women in late 19th century America, she defied nearly every traditional expectation of how women should behave, especially when it came to business and money. She was one of the first American women to accumulate a vast fortune through her own efforts. Yet behind the newspaper headlines lay a woman shaped by a strict Quaker upbringing, fierce loyalty to her family, and the challenges of a world that did not expect a woman to hold her own in the rough and tumble realm of high finance. Her journey still has the power to captivate us, offering lessons on resilience, independence, and the perils of letting money loom too large. Born Henrietta Howland Robinson on November 21, 1834, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, she entered the world at a time when the United States was steadily forging its identity. The nation was still relatively young, the Civil War lay on the horizon, and industrialization had started to reshape American life. New Bedford, in particular, flourished as a whaling port. Men made fortunes sailing the seas in pursuit of whale oil, used for lamps and machinery lubricants. Among these men was Hetty's father, Edward Mott Robinson, and her grandfather, Gideon Howland, both deeply involved in maritime commerce. The family's Quaker faith preached simplicity, humility, and hard work. Yet it didn't stop them from amassing substantial wealth. By the time Hetty was old enough to read, the Robinson and Howland families had grown quite comfortable. From her earliest days, Hetty was unusually curious about commerce. At the age of 2, according to one family anecdote, she was already fascinated by numbers and calculations. Her father delighted in this, seeing in her a spark of intelligence and practicality that he felt was lacking in many women of the era. Indeed, in the mid-19th century, girls from well-off families were generally taught domestic arts, music, and manners. Finances were handled by fathers or husbands, not daughters. But Hetty's father broke this pattern. He read stock quotes to her from the newspaper and encouraged her to think critically about money. Her grandfather also played a pivotal role. He took her on errands to banks and let her observe how transactions were made. Although many around them deemed it strange, the two men believed that if Hetty was sharp, she should learn how to handle the family's finances, no matter her gender. By the time she was in her teens, she could parse a balance sheet better than most adults. She also found that people tended to underestimate her. A shy, small-framed girl with piercing eyes, she learned to hide her confidence beneath a quiet demeanor. In her diaries, few remain, but some references survived. She hinted at wanting nothing more than to control her destiny through money. She understood that money meant independence, and independence, especially for a woman of her era, was a rare and precious commodity. One lesser-known but illuminating anecdote from her adolescence centers on her response to a moment of family crisis. Her mother, Abby Howland Robinson, was ill for much of Hetty's teen years. During one of her mother's hospital stays, Hetty took charge of household finances, insisting that her father show her exactly where every dollar was invested. She wanted to be prepared in case tragedy struck. The neighbors called her cold or unfeeling, but her father admired her for it. It wasn't that she lacked emotion, she just refused to be caught off guard if life took an unexpected turn. This unyielding practicality would become her hallmark, for better or worse. By her early 20s, Hetty was in line to inherit a substantial portion of the family fortune. When her father died in 1865 and her beloved Aunt Sylvia died soon after, Hetty sought to consolidate the inheritance. She faced immediate pushback from other relatives who questioned whether a young woman had the right or the skill to manage such sums. The situation grew combative, culminating in lawsuits and acrimonious disputes over the estate. At one point, Hetty produced a will allegedly made by Aunt Sylvia that favored her over other family members. The relatives called the document a forgery. The matter was never resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The press began to follow the story, getting their first taste of the strong-willed, shrewd young woman who refused to back down. Now independently wealthy, though the size of her fortune was debated, Hetty moved to New York City, determined to invest in stocks and bonds, to speculate in real estate, and to play the market just like the most seasoned male financiers. It was an unusual move for a woman to show up at banking halls alone or to negotiate railroad shares in her own name. Yet she exuded such confidence that many bankers found themselves simultaneously puzzled and impressed. At first, they tried to take advantage of her, assuming she was an easy target. They quickly discovered otherwise. In one instance, as recounted in period newspapers, a banker attempted to push her toward worthless stocks. Hetty grilled him with pointed questions and saw right through his scheme. Word spread that she was no naive heiress. In 1867, Hetty married Edward Henry Green, known as Ned. He was a Vermont-born businessman with a friendly disposition and moderate wealth of his own. They met in a social circle of Boston and New York families. Some observers suspected that Ned was initially drawn to Hetty because of her money. Others said he was genuinely fascinated by her intellect and ambition. For her part, Hetty insisted on a prenuptial agreement, a rarity in those days, making it clear that her fortune was hers alone to manage. The couple eventually had 2 children, a daughter, Sylvia, and a son, Edward Ned, Jr. Observers described the marriage as a complicated partnership. Hetty respected Ned's easygoing nature but grew frustrated if she felt he was too lax with finances. Ned, on the other hand, sometimes grew exasperated by Hetty's unwavering frugality. Despite being fabulously wealthy, she insisted they live in modest lodgings rather than a grand estate. Family photos from the era show them wearing simple clothing. Hetty disliked extravagant dresses or parties, calling them wasteful. Over the next several decades, she solidified her place as a force on Wall Street. Hetty specialized in buying undervalued assets during economic panics, especially railroads. America was experiencing rapid expansion in rail networks, but also cyclical crashes. For instance, during the Panic of 1873, Hetty bought bonds from struggling rail companies at bargain prices. She patiently waited for the economy to rebound, then sold or restructured those holdings at a significant profit. She had a knack for staying calm in the face of market frenzy. Where others saw danger, she saw opportunity. Her motto, she often said, was buy cheap and never sell. In reality, she did sell from time to time, but only when she believed it was absolutely advantageous. Yet her investment prowess wasn't the only thing capturing public attention. Her personal life, marked by extreme thrift, turned her into a curious figure of gossip. Although she could afford the finest homes, she rented small apartments in unglamorous neighborhoods, often under assumed names. Rather than hire servants, she cooked her own meals. According to some accounts, she wore the same black dress for years. If it tore, she would stitch it up. She avoided hot water to save on fuel costs. These stories, passed from neighbor to neighbor, began to paint a picture of a miserly woman whose wealth was rumored to be enormous, but who refused to spend even a cent beyond the bare essentials. People started calling her the richest woman in America and the cheapest, or less kindly, the Witch of Wall Street. She reportedly retorted, "I am saving money for my children so they won't face the struggles I did." Over time, the public latched onto the more sensational aspects of her thrift, leading to caricatures and jokes in newspapers. She was labeled the greatest miser, although it's possible certain episodes were exaggerated. At the heart of these stories lies a more poignant truth. Hetty grew up believing security came only from financial independence. She had witnessed how quickly fortunes could vanish if not managed wisely. She had also seen how men in her family navigated money with confidence. She was determined not to be reliant on any man, even her husband. This deeply rooted fear of poverty may have driven her to extremes. In her diaries, friends recall occasional glimpses of vulnerability, like the time she confessed to a confidant that she worried incessantly about the future of her children, certain that wolves stand waiting at every corner to take it all away. That confession reveals the anxious undercurrent that might have fueled her famed stinginess. The strangest, and perhaps saddest, example of her thrift's consequences centers on her son, Edward Jr. As a boy, Ned injured his knee. Rather than seek immediate top-tier medical care, Hetty tried to find a free clinic, supposedly to avoid paying high doctor's fees. Accounts vary, and some say this detail was overblown by the press, but it is confirmed that Ned's injury became severely complicated. Eventually, part of his leg had to be amputated. For the sensationalist newspapers of the time, it was a perfect story. The richest woman in the country refused to pay for her own son's care, resulting in an amputation. Whether the blame truly lay with her miserliness or with the limited medical knowledge of the era remains debatable. Yet the damage to her public image was immense. After that, the press fully embraced her witch persona. She rarely gave interviews, but when she did, she tried to defend her actions, claiming she provided proper care and that the complication was simply unfortunate. The public, however, preferred the scandalous version. While these controversies roiled in the tabloids, Hetty's marriage also endured strains. Edward Henry Green was more social, more inclined to spend, and that clashed with Hetty's austere approach. At times they lived separately for extended periods, yet they never formally divorced. In fact, in later years, when Ned faced legal and financial troubles, Hetty stepped in, discreetly, and orchestrated deals to keep him afloat. Underneath the rumors of heartlessness, there was loyalty toward her family that few recognized. She simply believed that enabling extravagance was dangerous, but if the matter was dire, like a looming lawsuit or a major debt, she'd intervene. In private letters to her daughter Sylvia, Hetty described her husband as too trusting in business partnerships, a trait she admired in theory but found frustrating in practice. Throughout the late 19th century, she consolidated her wealth in real estate, government bonds, railroads, and shipping lines. She also provided private loans to desperate business owners, charging high interest. Critics accused her of taking advantage of those in dire straits, but she always insisted it was a fair transaction. She assumed risk in lending money when banks refused, so she was entitled to a premium. On certain occasions, she foreclosed on properties, adding to her real estate empire in cities like Chicago and St. Louis. She had a particular fondness for mortgages, seeing them as a relatively secure investment. Her net worth soared. By the early 1900s, she was likely worth over $100 million. Although exact figures are hard to confirm due to her secretive nature. This made her not just one of the richest women in America, but one of the richest people, period. Her relationship with Wall Street itself was paradoxical. She was both revered and reviled. Legendary financiers like J. Pierpont Morgan and Jay Gould were said to respect her acumen, but they also found her personally aloof and uncooperative. She refused to join any large syndicates or alliances. She rarely speculated on margin, preferring to buy assets outright with her own cash. This was unusual. Many major players used leverage extensively. Yet her caution served her well, allowing her to survive and thrive through multiple financial panics, including the panic of 1907. While others scrambled to cover margin calls, Hetty sat on her stable empire, snapping up bargains once again. Meanwhile, her children grew into adulthood, forging their own paths. Her daughter Sylvia married Matthew Wilkes and led a more conventional, affluent lifestyle, though she still had to answer to her mother for large expenditures. Her son Ned, with his prosthetic leg, became a financial figure in his own right, dabbling in railroad projects and occasionally turning to Hetty for guidance. Some newspapers speculated that Ned shared his mother's business savvy. He was known for flamboyance, though, the polar opposite of Hetty's modesty. He cruised around in luxury vehicles, hosted lavish parties, and occasionally drew his mother's wrath for burning through money. Yet she loved him deeply, and in letters to acquaintances she referred to Ned as "my dear boy." Observers found it baffling that the so-called Witch of Wall Street would speak so tenderly. This complexity never fit neatly into the public's caricature. As time wore on, public sentiment toward her softened just a little, partly because she outlasted many of her harshest critics. By the early 1900s, she was an elderly figure often seen walking the streets of Manhattan with a cane, wearing her signature dark clothing. She kept up with business until nearly the end of her life, scribbling notes on stock quotes and making personal visits to her bankers. Yet her health began to deteriorate. Years of stress and possible malnutrition took their toll. In July 1916, Hetty suffered a series of strokes. On July 3, 1916, she died at the age of 81 in her son's home. The cause of death was listed as apoplexy, an old-fashioned term for stroke. Her children were at her bedside. It's said that one of her final regrets was not living long enough to see how certain railroad investments would turn out. Her passing triggered a wave of newspaper coverage that rivaled the eulogies given to presidents and captains of industry. While some papers wrote mean-spirited obituaries painting her as a stingy miser, others tried to reevaluate her in historical context. They pointed out her extraordinary skill at a time when most women weren't even allowed to vote. They lauded her business acumen in an era dominated by men who often manipulated markets with questionable ethics. A handful of more thoughtful pieces noted that she donated to charities anonymously, suggesting that she wasn't entirely heartless. Indeed, bits and pieces of evidence have emerged over the years that she gave quietly to churches or to individuals in need, but insisted on secrecy for reasons that remain a bit mysterious. In her will, she left much of her fortune to her two children. This is where another layer of nuance emerges. Far from disowning them, she set them up securely. Over the following years, Ned would become a notable figure in Texas politics, while Sylvia led a comfortable life traveling between different family estates. Some historians have argued that they changed their mother's public narrative by focusing on her devotion to them and ignoring her famously austere style. Yet ironically, their comfortable, even lavish lifestyles stood in stark contrast to her decades of thrift. Still, they always spoke of her with respect, if not exactly glowing affection. And that's all for today's video. Don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe so you'll always be in the loop. Thanks for watching.